Hi, everybody. This is another Warburg work in progress, but a bit like the one that we did a few weeks ago on the Atalanta Fugiens and the new digital edition. This is a little bit unusual in terms of our format. Once again, like that one, we've invited some external speakers to discuss a recent book. In this case, with responses by several Warburg scholars. The speaker is Federico Campagna, and he has generously agreed to join us to talk about two books, in fact, not just his recent 2018 book, Technic and Magic, but also to give us a bit of a glimpse of his forthcoming book, due out in 2021, on prophetic culture. You can read Federico's really interesting bio on his website, but just to say, if you haven't had a chance to do so, it's worth saying that he spent a couple decades in Milano, where he was deeply involved in political activism and street poetry, but in 2007 moved to London, where he created a multilingual platform for critical theory and pursued postgraduate degrees at Goldsmiths and the Royal College of Art. In his day job, he runs the rights department for Verso Books, but he also carves out a really admirable amount of time for his own research and writing, as well as curatorial projects. Running through that wide-ranging career, as you have already gathered, I'm sure, is a deep commitment to experimental philosophy. And I discovered when he interviewed me a couple of weeks ago for a podcast that he calls Over Morrow's Library, which Federico hopefully will be coming out in the next weeks, months. Yeah, okay. He also has a very deep engagement with the approaches to magic pioneered here at the Warburg Institute. First, of course, by our founder, A.B. Warburg, and his main collaborator, Fritz Axel, in Hamburg, but then especially here in London by figures such as Francis Yates, Perkin Walker, even now Charles Burnett and John Tresh. So we're going to start with a short summary of the excerpt circulated by Federico on these two books, and then we're going to have three responses by scholars working at the Warburg. And I'll just quickly introduce people now, but you might, as part of your comments, start, if you remember by then, by saying a little bit about how you come at this work, what your position is in responding to the work. But technically, in terms of positions, institutional positions, John is, of course, our Mellon Professor in the history of art, science, and folk practice, and a great comparative cosmologist. Liana Saif has been associated with the Institute for many years, but is part of an EU-funded project on philosophy in Al-Andalus in 10th century. Very, very experienced scholar on both texts and artifacts in the history of magic, particularly in Islam. And then Beatrice Bottomley, who is a PhD student here at the Warburg Institute. And I just want to single out Beatrice and thank her for proposing this particular session and actually for doing most of the heavy lifting in organizing it. So Bea, thank you very much for getting us all here together. So here we all are, and without further ado, that's the choreography, and I'm not going to hand over to Federico, who will give us an admirable summary at lightning speed of two extremely ambitious books. First unmuting. Oh, have I? Sorry. Now, you may unmute.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. You can, yeah. I will also spotlight you just for the sake of focus. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill, for the introduction, and thank you, Beatrice, for organizing this, and John and Diana for coming on board. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. So the task is a bit complicated, that of summarizing two books in 15 minutes, but I'll do my best. So the two books that I will try to present briefly are Technic and Magic, which I wrote in 2018, and the book called Prophetic Culture, which will come out in the next few months. I'll start with Technique and Magic, which was an attempt at applied Neoplatonism and applied anarchism in a sense. If I also try to explain what the book tries to do, every book tries to do something. This one tried to do three things. So first was trying to criticize the notion of reality that we have at the moment in the westernized modern world. Presenting it not as the reality as it is, but as an idea about reality, as a theory, as an hypothesis which we enact in practice. Secondly, was trying to suggest a method to interpret reality systems in different moments in history, in different civilizations. And thirdly, was an attempt to imagine an alternative reality system to the present one. The way in which I tried to do it was also aesthetic in a sense. So I was borrowing Luca Pacioli's, the inventor of accountancy, so to say, his way of understanding partita doppia as a balanced form in which the plus and minuses, the losses and gains would be balanced in this geometrical structure. This sounds very abstract, and it is in part, but the reason why I wrote this book was not just abstract, it was also had to do with some problems, personal problems, which I thought were in part relatable as collective problems as well. The personal problem had to do with the feeling of an increasing unreality to reality. The notion of what we see around ourselves as truly being there, somehow being challenged and starting to crumble to a certain extent. And especially what was crumbling was the position of the subject, of the person within this reality. So the lack of a place to which a person could withdraw once maybe they lost everything within the world, and from which they could depart in order to restart creating or claiming a dignified life. So as you see, the attempt was quintessentially political in a sense, but the book is not political at all. I was not tackling this through a political language, but through the language of metaphysics. So especially the common sense metaphysics that we adopt in our daily life, our understanding of what makes up the world, whether this room is populated by objects or by spirits or by molecules or energies or whatever else. It is in that sense a form of pre-political work. So I was not trying to suggest an endpoint to action and imagination, an utopia, so to say, but a starting point, a different starting point from which we could begin to imagine. The basic premise of the book, Technique and Magic, the basic methodological premise, so to say, is very simple. And it is that everything always makes sense. Whenever we encounter within the social life of a group of humans, certain objects or institutions that might seem abhorrent or horrendous to us, we should keep in mind that these objects always make sense. They make sense within a certain understanding, not only of social life and culture, but also of the world in itself. And this particular understanding, this reality system, allows for certain ranges of possibilities, allows for the creation of certain institutions or certain objects as reasonable, allows for a certain range of the possible. Certain things are possible and reasonable to think, to do, to imagine, and simultaneously cuts out of reality a number of other things. They become superstitions. So the possible and the superstitious. It would be interesting to trace a history of civilizations with the movement of the history of superstitions. So the kind of corollary to this was also that when we try to approach the problem of transforming the social institutions of a certain society, or erasing from that society certain objects that we don't like, we have to intervene not only politically on that object and that institution, but also pre-politically, challenging the very constraints and frame of meaning that allows for those things to take place, that makes them reasonable and possible. So that was the basic fundamental premise, but the first question of the book was, what kind of frame of sense, what kind of reality system, what kind of idea of what makes up the world is necessary to sustain the objects that we see around ourselves, that if one stops a moment to think about them, not always, actually very rarely, are immediately naturally endowed with meaning and sense. Sometimes they might look strange or horrendous? So what kind of frame of meaning would sustain them? And I was trying to understand the reality system of the westernized world, which I called technic. I called technic in the sense that I borrowed the term. I borrowed it from Martin Heidegger, Emanuele Severino, and Ernest Junger in particular, as well as in its interpretation from Franco Berardi Bifo, Italian Marxist autonomist. So you see, it's quite a variegated range of references that goes between Nazism and autonomist Marxism. To describe the system of reality of technic, the one in which whoever lives in the westernized modern parts of the world, which are globally dispersed, we live, I identified, or I believed I could identify, a fundamental principle, let's say a kernel, that sustains the entire architecture of this project of reality. That principle I called absolute language. And it can be summarized very simply, just by looking at its three main tenets. These are implicit tenets that are necessary to sustain a number of our social institutions. The first one is the belief that language can, at least potentially, cover everything. Language can at least potentially describe exhaustively and comprehensively everything that there is. It is on the basis of this idea, obviously, that massive investments in big data, for example, make sense. Only by believing that it is possible to truly map the world through data, through language. And when I say language, I mean any kind of language, scientific, financial, medical, and so on and so forth, political. On the basis of that idea, then it makes sense to invest in big data, which truly map the world. The second tenet is that whatever resists this reduction to language, whatever resists this reduction to language, absolutely, whatever cannot in any way be reduced to language, does not exist. And this also justifies an attitude that we have at the moment towards the creation of identities. A lot of minoritarian groups correctly understand that if they wish to retain a legitimate place within this particular society, they need to attach a label to themselves. If a thing is not attached to a label, to something that can be cataloged taxonomically within this production of language, that thing does not legitimately exist. And thirdly, the third tenet is that ultimately, what truly exists in the world, what this pencil is made of, what everything is made of, what I am truly made of in terms of my stuff, that stuff is language. The world is made by language, of language only. And this is also the implicit idea that and allows for certain other things to make sense. For example, the fact that when you pass through a border control, it's not you passing through the border control, it's your passport. You are the awkward human appendix to your passport in the way that in the First World War, soldiers were the awkward human appendixes to their weapons. By the same token, this allows for politicians in the country I come from, Italy, for example, to let thousands of migrants drown, or equivalent people in the sense of people that have fallen out of many series of language, such as income, citizenship, and so on and so forth, to be trashed and disappear, because nothing truly happened, nothing was truly lost. So these are also the political consequences of this, but the book, as I said, is on metaphysics. And so I was observing, in particular, the metaphysical consequence of this form of reality. When language encloses the world entirely, and there is no space for something outside of language to take place within reality, what truly happens metaphysically is that we deny a very important aspect of life in the world, which is existence. Existence itself, in its pure state, the fact that this object exists, the fact that this exists, this remains completely impermeable to linguistic inquiry. I can say everything I wish about this pen, its history, its molecular composition, its color, and so on and so forth. But if I am interrogated about it's being something rather than nothing, suddenly I fall silent. That resists language forever. And for that reason, it is eradicated out of the idea of reality that we entertain at the moment. And because of that, reality itself begins to crumble on the one hand, and life becomes a tightrope walk between the prison of language and the abyss of absolute nothingness. So I was trying to imagine an alternative, and I imagined this alternative by calling it magic. An alternative in the sense of an alternative reality system, an alternative idea on how on what composes reality and how we can imagine the very stuff of the world around ourselves, which in turn defines the realm of the possible. I called it magic etymologically, first of all. Magic from magike tekne is the art of the magi. Magike tekne, of course, is a Greek sentence. And for the Greeks, the magi, the priestly caste of the Persians, constituted the absolute other. Not the barbarians were the absolute other to the Greeks, but the Persians, the nemesis of the Greeks. So the magike tekne, the art of the magi, the art of the Persians, represents to us, them, to this, that, truly an alternative from the perspective to which it's uttered. In another sense, I used magic also to pay tribute to the Neoplatonic tradition in late antiquity, Iamblichus, for example, and in the Renaissance. I think, for example, the way in which Pico della Mirandola describes magic or distinguishes between forms of magic in the oration on the dignity of the human. To develop this idea, I sought the help of many a great thinker, obviously, and I sourced most of my references from the large Mediterranean world. A disclaimer is necessary. The large Mediterranean world is not a geographical location. It's what James Hillman would call a region of the spirit. It goes from the India of Advaita Vedanta through the Iran of Mullah Sadra, the Andalusia of Ibn Arabi, and the Portugal of Fernando Pessoa. Okay, so this is the range of which we are speaking. This reality system of magic is different from that of technique in a fundamental sense. When he recreates his architecture of reality, it doesn't place at the center language, what we can say about something, but it places ineffability. It places at the center what Aristotle and Plato just called thauma, so the feeling of awe and wonder and terror that is at the basis of philosophy as it is at the basis of life. The mysterium tremendum et fascinans, as Rudolf Otto puts it in terms of religion, which also applies to the fact of encountering existences, including one's own. On the basis of this, the rest of the architecture unfolds. And I was discussing that in the book using a number of figures that I cannot, of course, explain here, such as person, symbol, the idea of notion of meaning, but especially the idea of the coincidence of opposites, coincidentia oppositorum, once again from the Renaissance, Nicholas of Cusa. The idea that the world itself, in its manifestation, in its being there, is always a coincidence of opposites, such as, for example, ineffability and language. When I finished the book, I realized that something was missing. As it's always the case, one writes a second book to make up for the previous one, and so on indefinitely, I guess. And what I realized was missing was an element of lived life within it. There was an abstract tone to the book, but my life is not abstract, obviously. And my life personally is spent mostly in the field of cultural production. Everybody's a cultural producer to a certain extent, but some people specialize as a trade, so to say, in it. So I was trying to imagine in what way it would be possible to use the ideas of technique and magic, that notion of reality, but in terms of creating a cultural form that would be able to speak from that position. And so I started writing, and I finished, and it will come out in a few months, a new book called Prophetic Culture. The point of prophetic culture, however, is not just, once again, an abstract discussion of how to create culture in that kind of way. It's also rooted in the present moment in which I find myself to live, and most of us find ourselves to live. We are standing as if on the tail of an historical trajectory that is about to end. The civilization, the form of reality that belongs to the society which we could call westernized modernity, for a number of reasons which we can discuss, seems to be coming to an end. This is not cause for concern, but simply specifies that we are making culture from the position of a present without a future and soon to be past. This is a peculiar place from which to speak. Why? Because when a civilization ends, when a certain form of meaning ends, when a certain reality system comes to an end as a narrative, historical narrative, the following one doesn't immediately understand what the previous one was talking about. The language is not immediately translatable. It becomes incomprehensible very, very rapidly. So the point of the book, Prophetic Culture, is to imagine a form of culture that would speak from the perspective of magic, but in a way that would be able to cross the boundaries between different forms of reality, different forms of worlding. In order to do that, to tackle that, I tried also to adopt a different style of writing. And the book is quite composite in that sense. First of all, it contains an iconographic apparatus, which was not present in the first one. And I would like to thank, if she's here, Arianna Casarini, who took charge of that and the selection of the images. But also the text has different registers. The main part of Prophetic Culture is a proper philosophy book, is a normal academic philosophy book, so to say, but with commentaries and notes that are extremely prominent in the way in which commentaries used to be very prominent in the actual manuscript of books from antiquity. I know that Bill Sherman, for example, is very interested in observing this particular tradition. That I try to put that in the text of the book. And in that first part, the philosophical part, I try to describe the style of prophetic culture. And my range of references here, once again, is from the broad Mediterranean world, and it goes from the Renaissance idea of the grotesque to the Muslim understanding of the figure of the prophet, not so much as an author, but as a position towards worlding, as a position of witnessing, almost as a human archetype, the perfect man. But also in terms of the creation of architectures of meaning, as described, for example, by Frances Yates when she studies Giulio Camillo and the tradition of memory theaters. And also some aspects of ethics within this idea of culture. And here, for example, I looked at the tradition of the Ismaili, of the Ismaili world in understanding God as a feeling God, an emotional God that suffers because of its isolation, cut off from reality. So the openness of reality is a requirement, so to say, for happiness. And finally, the Greek Orthodox tradition of apokatastasis, which I see as an alternative to apocalypse. Apocalypse is the final judgment and the end of time that defines everything as forever saved or forever damned. Apokatastasis is the idea that this judgment happens always and already everything is already saved. Once again, the point is not, for me, in my attempt, not to create an end point to the final trajectory, but a starting point from which to depart. And finally, the book ends with a section in which I try to present the general cosmology that I would like to describe, but in the form of a story. It's written like a journey between islands, each island representing a dimension of this form of reality. The inspiration was René Daumal's book, Mount Analog. René Daumal, surrealist, poet, translator from Sanskrit, and many other things. But also the experience also of dealing with children and telling stories to children and young adults. This is all that I can say in this amount of time, and I hope it manages to give an idea of what the two books are about and what they try to do. And yeah, thank you for your patience and for listening.
Oh, Federico, thank you so much. It's extremely compelling and gives at least a sense of the scope of what both of these books set out to do. So I think they help to open up some discussion, but I think hopefully also these three invited speakers, now respondents from within the Warburg, will also draw out different aspects of these two very different projects. But thank you, that was extremely clear and concise. So John Trash, first over to you.
Okay, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Federico. That was really illuminating, and you really did cover quite a lot that's in the two books. I'm sharing my screen. Can you see it? Okay, this is just taken from. I want to reiterate some of the things that Federico said for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading the books, and just highlight a couple points that really struck me, and ask a few questions. We're each meant to speak for 5 to 10 minutes. So just to highlight what he said is the origin of technic and magic, the sense of a world breaking down, a sense of like really visible problems and a collapse of a reality system. And I had the feeling this was written maybe sometime in November 2016 or maybe December, and the sense that the world as we thought we knew it isn't functioning any longer, ecologically, politically. So as he says, to seek an alternative to the contemporary condition of metaphysical nihilism, epidemics of mental illness, hyperexploitation, and environmental devastation, we have to pass first and foremost through a fundamental rethinking of the reality conditions that allow such processes to take place. Imagining a cosmology that is truly and starkly alternative to that which rules our world is a matter of necessity, not philosophical solipsism. Like everything dictated by urgency and by necessity, its edges might be rough, its character worryingly experimental, yet the spirit that animates it infuses it with its own intensity. Whether the end result will be able to match the expectations and the urgency that originated it is for the readers to judge. So that lays out where he's coming from, just a sense that there is an absolute urgency, an ontological, metaphysical urgency to rethink all that is, to rethink the fundamental conditions of existence that we're facing now, rather than take all that is as inevitable, given, and fatalistic. He uses the philosopher's detachment to step out of this world, of this way of being in the cosmos, this seeming necessity and self-evidence, in order to say, well, how does any world system come into being and have that kind of self-evidence, have that kind of necessity? So that's the overall structure of his thinking and his writing here. What brings a world together? What holds a cosmos together? And then in order to apply that theory, when what he calls his applied Neoplatonism and applied anarchism, he first gives us the reality structure of the world we're in and calls that technic, and then gives us the reality structure of an alternative world, and that's the one he calls magic. And he mentioned the aesthetic structure or organization of the book, and I think that's really very important for a technique in magic, the way in which it begins with the experience or the existential conditions of living in technique, in the world of technique, then the metaphysical principles, organizing structures of technique. Then there's a little interlude about what is reality, why not, just go large, and then mirroring the first half, it's the metaphysical structure of magic, and then the existential structure of magic. So there's this very nice kind of mirroring and guide through the book. So although it's quite wild in the number and of things that it covers, as well as the authors it brings in, that structure is a very useful guidepost. And this is in a nutshell. This is at the start of the book, and I found myself going back to it as I was reading the book. This is the parallel structure of the two cosmogonies, the two systems of reality. Technic on the one side, magic on the other side, and the chiasmus of the chiasmatic structure, where the ABBA of the book is mirrored here in the way in which the lower limits are juxtaposed with the upper limits of the two systems. Just to walk through the technic side, for starters, which I found really compelling. As Federico said, absolute language is the assumption of the technic system, that anything can be represented. And actually, anything that is can be represented. And if it can't be represented, it isn't. It doesn't exist. Actually, in Prophetic Culture, I found this claim about the underlying absolute necessity of language and technique to be clarified by his insistence on the technic system being equivalent or really being based on the principle of non-contradiction, right? So that a world in which everything is only itself and cannot be more than one thing at the same time. It either is or is not. That's the theory of language and of an absolute universal language that grounds this system of technic. From there, it's following a Neoplatonic structure, framework, where you've got the absolute emanating outward, falling downward into gradations of being. Yeah, and as they fall away from the absolute, the intensity or urgency or energy of each of these emanations diminishes. So following that structure, the absolute of language next descends into the hypostasis of measure, where everything that is can be counted, then units. Those things get broken down into bytes, bits, pieces of information and data. And then more generally, processors, and ultimately humans are understood as processors of information. And then finally, at the level of basically how do we deal with this world that has emanated out from this absolute of absolute language? What are our strategies? What are the kind of guiding orientations of this world? Federico announces life as vulnerability. And I thought that was a very illuminating. It's the thought that whatever exists, we try to keep it safe. We try to preserve it. We want to keep it within the limits of a kind of predictable and enduring existence. And you see this in insurance companies. You see it in in public health. You see it in the language of politics. You see it in life strategies. You see it in self-help. How do we keep safe? How do we keep things safe? So that's the technic structure. The magic structure matches it, but instead of insisting on everything being controlled by language or by absolute language, it begins with the ineffable emerging into life, emerging into the miraculous. And life itself, which is not limited to the things we call organic beings in Federico's version of the cosmology, life is in everything. There's a kind of underlying pantheism here. The miracle of existence is the first step of incarnation. Then moving through person, symbol, meaning, and paradox, and I'd invite Federico in dialogue to expand on what he means by these, ultimately to this lower limit of paradox, where, as he said, there is a coincidence of opposites. In any visible entity of the world, any experienceable entity of the world, there is at the same time present that ineffable, the foundational absolute that produces life and creation in the first point. And that's, in a sense, the kind of redemption in the fallenness of the world of existence. Because always it's possible in that world of existence to retrace the steps of the ladder back up to the first miracle, and before that, the ineffable itself. So I wanted to just give you, those of you who didn't read the book, a sense of how these two structures work. And the overall structure of the book works. I have some questions just to throw at Federico, and maybe you don't have to answer them at all. There will probably be other questions from the audience and from the other speakers. But one is, I mean, how exciting and exhilarating it was for me to see Neoplatonism not as an object of remote study, but as a theory to work with, as a philosophy that can be operationalized to make sense of the world. And I thought that was extremely striking, extremely audacious as the range of authors that Federico is dealing with, from the Sufi mystics, through Shia authors, through the history of Western philosophy, delving into perennialist historians of religion. Mircea Eliade plays a pretty important role here, along with Corbin Guénon and others. Quite a bit of poetry, all in order to make sense of a world that is dominated by data, by big data, and dominated by screens and digital science. So I think it's extremely striking, ambitious, and persuasive to take this very large corpus, large philosophical tradition, and mobilize it to make sense of our world. That said, it does pose some problems, because in a way that then becomes taken on board as the underlying metaphysics. Even though the technical and the magical are two different metaphysical systems, two different worlds, nevertheless, the basic framework is the same, in that you have an underlying absolute that then emanates down through different layers. That is itself a metaphysics. It's not a general pre-metaphysical structure. It is an assumption of the basic format of metaphysics. So there's a sense of a kind of pre-programming of all the possible programs of worlds that Federico is opening up as possibilities. And I just wonder if he thinks that's inevitable, built into it, or is that possibly a cause of concern? If we want to be able to consider multiple cosmologies, should it not be possible for those different cosmologies to have their own intrinsic structures, to have their own principles of hierarchy, their own principles of how different things relate to each other, instead of bringing them all under this extremely persuasive and extremely long-standing Neoplatonic structure? More concretely, in the magic section, especially where Federico's talking about how one would live in a world not bound by the strictures of technic, but in a world that is opened up through the reimagination of cosmology via magic. He puts a lot of importance on processes of initiation, the sense that being exposed to a new world, brought into a new world, awakened to a new world, requires the kind of ritual structures that people have called initiation. And yet the existential presentation of magic insists on its individuality, insists on the fact that this is something that everyone can do, anyone can do, and ultimately does for oneself. So I was extremely interested to hear the political background to Federico's thinking here, that this is a wish to rethink politics in a very roundabout way. But what is the political or social possibility of a system where the individual is so insistent, especially given that initiation requires an initiator, right? Someone has to bring you through this, and there has to be an existing structure. So just dealing with the coincidence of opposites here of individual and society, how do you think that in terms of the experience of magic? And then just a last thought, again, turning to questions of social reality. This is a rather stark opposition that's presented here, technic and magic. You're either in one or you're in the other. My experience and my sense of the world and of friends of mine and people I talk to is that a lot of people actually have one foot in each world. And this can take the form of being New Agers, being very, very interested in the revelations of astrology, having taken many Buddhist retreats, practicing mindfulness, being monastics, being monks and nuns, being part-time mystics. These are people who often have day jobs and are themselves accountants or are themselves data scientists. How do you think of living between these worlds? How do you think of the superimposition of the magical and the technical, given that it seems to be the reality that a lot of us are actually living or striving to live right now within the world that you see as so doomed in technic? That was my last question. And again, thanks, Federico, for writing these books and for being here, and for making this conversation happen.
Thank you, John. Fantastic. Federico, it's very cruel, but I'm not going to allow you to respond right now. But file away those questions. We'll see what we get to when we have time for your response to the responses. But if we don't keep moving, we'll be here all day, which would be great. Much more interesting than what is supposed to come later in the day. But anyway. So if we can move on, then maybe Liana, you would go next. I don't see you, but where are you? I will ask you to unmute, and hopefully now, yes?
Hi. Yes.
Hi. Yes, there you are. Yes, great.
Great. First of all, I want to thank Federico for sharing his work with us and the rationale behind the compositions of two books. And also about your admirable call for reimagining cosmology to generate an alternative to the one that has been produced by indeed hyper-exploitation in a lot of ways, whether it was of capitalism, patriarchy, whatever. As a historian, I am personally interested in the genealogies of ideas and concepts that inform cosmologies and their alternatives. And having focused on the case of Islam for so long, my comments are going to be revolving around it with Beatrice in mind, considering that her research is focused on the character of Ibn Arabi and his work. So in a way, talking to you both and everyone at the same time. And considering that I don't have a lot of time, I'm gonna allow me to focus on just one tight aspect to complement the more general survey that John has shown us. So I'm gonna start with a quote from Technique and Magic in page 113, moving on to 114. So Federico writes, throughout Western history, magic has acted as the silent shadow of the most hegemonic cultural forms, from philosophy to theology to modern science. Yet any attempt to provide a complete and detailed history of magic is necessarily destined to fail. This is partly because magic does not recognize history as its own temporal category, and partly because this branch of practical knowledge has always veiled itself in mystery and secrecy, both on account of the peculiarity of its horizon and due to its marginal place within society. And surprisingly then, the prevailing Western understanding of magic throughout the centuries has been plagued by gross inaccuracies that have at times entirely distorted not only the factual history, but also the meaning and the spirit of magic's work, end of quote. And I am completely in agreement with this statement, and much can be said about the importance of laying out how magic has become demoted in the way that we generate our cosmologies and world-making processes. But also, I would like to just look at this sentiment expressed from a different historical possession, because it sounds, what I've just read, sounds like a lament that was made by René Guénon, who's discussed in your work, but in his own work called The Influence of Islamic Civilization in the West by René Guénon. And I will quote Guénon here. He writes, "The Europe of our day no longer has anything that might recall these sciences," and he's referring to esoteric occult sciences. So the Europe of our day no longer has anything that might recall these sciences. Beyond this, the West is ignorant of the true knowledge represented by esotericism and its related sciences. Although in the Middle Ages, it was completely otherwise. And in this sphere too, Islamic influence appeared in a most luminous and evident way, end of quote. So in my work on Islamic esotericism, particularly on the work that I've done trying to understand what Islamic esotericism is, I argue that Islamic esotericism is a discursive concept with a long history that dates back at least to the 8th century. Guénon's Islamic esotericism must be, however, understood against the background of Western esotericism's own negotiation of the crisis of modernity and the post-Enlightenment destabilization of the relationship of science and religion. As elaborated in his other works, such as The Crisis of the Modern World, we see that for Guénon, esoteric sciences afford an ideation of science enmeshed in religion. Islam here, Islam as it is imagined by Guénon. Such sciences not only function on the level of reality as other exact sciences, that's not the point that Guénon is trying to make, to exact these sciences, but rather to point at them as a kind of sciences that sublimate awareness to the level of the macrocosm, from which one can draw on the emanative scheme for self-salvation, for the salvation of community, etc. But on the other hand, let's look at another shift of influence based on the same sentiment. And here I draw on the work of B. Harun Kujuk, who have noted that this type of thinking that we saw in Guénon is one way that Islam was used as a religion for European ends, particularly in the works of Draper and White. He describes that narrative quite well, the narrative about the European uses of Islam. And he says that more or less Islam served to accentuate claims about Christianity and Westernness and the creation of Western identity in the 20th century. Studies in this vein investigated the relationship between science and religion in the Middle Ages and tended to focus on Arab thinkers whose works had become canonical in the development of European thoughts. Such what I call is the Islamic sweethearts of the West, Ibn Arabi, al-Suhrawardi, and Ibn Sina, right? So Islam was used in this context as a basis of trans-historical understanding of all religion, including the occult sciences and magic. In this capacity, the study of Islam was used not only to level criticisms against the medieval church, but also to lead to conclusions about the very nature of religion and of Christianity that were as valid in the Middle Ages as they were in 19th century Europe. So we can see here like a continuity, but also an epistemological shift and a shift of purposes. But it's very fruitful to keep in mind of these things. And now, Federico, one of the in a note attached to this excerpts that I read, you point out that your notion of history and temporality are drawn from Anand Kumaraswamy book on time and eternity. And it's important to look at that. For me as a historian, I deal with time. So in one way or the other. So in time and eternity, indeed, I agree with Kumaraswamy in the sense that confusion arises when we think of time as something that is simultaneously the past, the present, and the future. Like instead, it's like an endless series of nows collectively adding up to time. And he writes that this confusion can be eliminated if we realize that none of these nouns have any duration, and that as measures, all alike are zeros, of which a sum is unthinkable. It is a matter of relativity. It is we who move. I am interested in the we, rather than the series of nows to which we relate, envision, and act upon. I feel that now, just as magic, are in themselves human attempts to deal with the cosmic indifference to our actions, whether they're admirable or despicable. I see the very ideation of magic as something independent. Sorry, I don't see that the ideation of magic is something independent from the agency of bodies, the very we-ness, but as a result of the measure that organizes and recognizes the religion of others as existing in a binary of systematic belief and chaotic practice, although the traditions themselves really challenge them. So in the context of technique as a fundamental alternative to magic, this is, for me, I see this language of technique and versus magic, or one as alternative to the other, as in a way an adherence to a binary of religion versus science, soul versus matter. And more interesting for me to look at is the notion of magic as, like Federico rightly says, as a form of therapy to technique's brutal regime over the world. If magic is the other, then what is the technique? Is the technique the Western technological and industrial dominance? This again recalls the traditionalists who were reacting with their universalism to very specific ideological crises of modernity. In addition to the universalist characteristic of Islamic esotericism and its exegetical basis, traditionalists like Sean and Guénaud employ it as an identity marker. For Sean, for example, embracing esotericism, Islamic in this case, is on the one hand a resuscitation of what the West once, and I quote, worshipped, but in the modern age has burnt. And on the other hand, it's an elevation of what he calls as the worldliness of Easterners, end of quote, and their excesses in body and soul. He also laments, and I quote, that it would be a mistake to conclude that the West possesses nothing in this respect and has everything to learn from the East. Grosso modo, the West possesses everything essential, but it does not wish to hear of it. And in this consists its drama and absurdity, end of quote. So when we talk about the Middle East as not geographical and as this orient of the spirit, it's implicated in this kind of thinking. It's implicated in the West using, in the case of what I study, Islam to European ends. So Guénaud and Sean thus cemented a traditionalist and perennialist view of Sufism under the term of Islamic esotericism. This view has become influential to such a degree that many traditional scholars who became key authorities on Islamic esotericism and spirituality wrote in similar terms. This is especially true of Henry Corbin, who is often described as a traditionalist, but he rejected that term. So we also read in Technic and Magic, and I quote, "Conversely, the language of magic is that of symbols, where a symbol stands for a semiotic sign which in no way attempts to fully convey and exhaust the object of its signification. As Henry Corbin pointed, every allegorical interpretation is harmless. The allegory is a sheathing, or rather a disguising of something that is already known or knowable otherwise, while the appearance of an image having the quality of a symbol is a primary phenomena, unconditional and irreducible, the appearance of something that cannot manifest itself otherwise to the world where we are." End of quote of Corbin and end of quote from Federico. Now, it's important to contextualize this within the context of perennialism of the 19th and 20th century, because it's heavily invested in reification. It's this something, this reality, the truth, true magic. So it's obsessed with reification. As it maneuvers its sincere fascination to magic and the occult sciences, and the othering that traditionalists and perennialists engaged via the Orientalism that informed their view of Islam and other religions. As a result of this was the sidestepping of the we of practitioners of the past by imposing time-specific and culture-specific allegories to the works of a selected number of agents that create a canon for the West, when in fact causality was just as important as semiology, and they formed part of a polyfocality and an epistemological co-presence that is characteristic of Islamic esotericism and the occult sciences. Another set of practitioners who also get sidestepped is indeed the magic of TV series like Charmed. And Federico, you do mention these as the confused witchcraft entertained by some teenage culture. I rather see them as legitimate for two reasons. One, globalization, in the sense that these are not imaginings of a distorting, disenchanted world of technique and modernity seen exclusively as Western. These belong now to the world because of TV, because of TikTok, etc. The second reason why I see that they are not confused is in the fact that they are cruising the material landscapes and the emotional horizons of our era with access of information that defies age and institution. I think they are legitimate practitioners in the same way Guénon is. Of course, the lenses through which magic is seen must always be open for critique, especially the extractive attitudes they often display and the commercialization which comes in hand with Orientalist trope. So I believe that TikTok teenagers and the traditionalists are better understood as instances of entanglement. The power relations are not symmetrical, never are. Therefore, but the form of this entanglement is based on the dynamics of complex networks of agents. After all, magic is agency, and agency is political. And I'm very interested in the political as part of the magical metaphysical approach. And I would love to be able to talk to Federico about his political approach to these problems as soon as possible. It's very, very exciting. And that's
Thank you. Thank you, Liana. I really didn't want to cut you off, and I'm glad I didn't before you got that great last line in. And again, these are just the beginnings of conversations. It's a huge topic or set of topics, and there's so much expertise being brought to bear. And I think this is really, in some ways, it should have been 3 different events. But let's carry on. And Beatrice, no pressure now, but you follow these 2 extremely impressive comments from John and Liana. So over to you for your comment.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Both the talk and the response, the comments are really interesting. I actually first came across Technic and Magic a couple of years ago when a friend lent me the book and asked me to tell her everything I knew about Sufism, which wasn't very much at the time and still isn't much. And I found myself coming back to Technic and Magic this summer. I really enjoyed the way that Federico engaged with many of the thinkers and sources that I myself engage with in my work. but he was bringing them into dialogue with questions that we face in our world today. And as both John and Liana pointed out, Prophetic Culture and Technic and Magic engage with quite a range of sources. And as I was reading, I found myself constantly noting down names and works. And yeah, Prophetic Culture also incorporates images, as Federico mentioned. And so each chapter begins with an image. We have at the beginning of the first chapter on time, the burial of Punchinello, and later on the chapter on westernized modernity, we have Mathias de Groote's engraving of Le Médecin Gros en Fantasy. And I was quite interested in this relationship between the images and the word. How do we read the images and the text together? And you did touch on that, Federico, and I would love to hear more about it if we have time. And as you also mentioned, in the last chapter, you use a fictional narrative to sketch out a potential cosmology. And so we have this movement from a more conventional authorial voice to a narrative voice. And maybe, you know, as you mentioned, this approach wasn't so unusual historically. It has become less usual now, but has also gained ground with the rising popularity of theory fiction. And I would be interested to hear more about the movement between different voices. And as you mentioned, and as also as it was picked up by Liana and John, the common thread in both works is this idea of absolute language, which you associate with Technic and Magic, and with westernized modernity in Prophetic Culture. And this is contrasted against an idea of the ineffable, something that cannot be captured by language. In Prophetic Culture, you'd say that under absolute language, anything that exists in the world must coincide with no linguistic classification. And in Technic and Magic, absolute language is described as a series of units or as the ultimate series system. And under this absolute language, primary existence is assigned to grammatical positions rather than semantic units. And these semantic units kind of indifferently fulfill the positions. And so things are reduced to being the case of a grammatical position. I think here you give the example of like a 1 or 0 in a programming series. And you know, this serial nature of language allows its position to proliferate indefinitely and provides the original example of a chain of production. And so reading this, I mean, my work is very much bathed in language. I work as a translator in my histories and my background's in literature. And you know, for me, I'm interested in this relationship between language and information. And from your description of absolute language, this came closer to how I think about information. And I don't want to seem pedantic, but I'm really interested to hear about how people differentiate between language and information and whether they think it's an important distinction to make. My instinct is that as we increasingly engage with digital objects in our everyday lives, it is an important distinction to make. And I think it relates also to the question of attention that Bill brought up in his talk on Monday. But yeah, I'm really interested to hear about what people think about information and language from the audience or panel members. And I guess, yeah, as Liana mentioned, I work with Ibn Arabi, and I think this interest in the distinction between information and language does stem from that work. For Ibn Arabi, language is an active mechanism of existence through which creation takes place, rather than a series or system through which you can organize existence. And so this takes us to the question of universality, which Liana touched on. You know, can we consider theories of language to be universal? Can we consider concepts of technic, magic, more modernity, or the binaries between them to be universal? And can we consider the ways in which they could frame reality to be universal? And I think Federico brings this question in with the way that he acknowledges different ways of worlding or understanding reality, and the way in which those approaches to worlding can be more or less marginalized and more or less dominant. In Technic and Magic, you know, magic is suggested as a way of kind of offering a subtle shift in perspective where the individual becomes able to recognize the primacy of the ineffable over linguistic description. And in Prophetic Culture, humans in a broader sense of the term and objects in the broader sense of the term bring about that shift or enable a remembering of other dimensions of reality. And you frame this through the concept of the pharmacon in Prophetic Culture. And I'm not going to talk about this here, 'cause I'm conscious of time, but I would love to hear more about it if someone in the audience wants to ask a question or wants to discuss it or talk about it. So I was interested in, in this idea of prophetic culture, like how far are the humans or objects agent in this process of remembering? And as John touched upon, and both Liana and John actually talked about, today in this world, there are people who are practicing ways of engaging with alternative approaches to reality. And these are often associated with therapy or therapy or ways of healing. And some of these practices have been critiqued for the way in which they are readily absorbed into a neoliberal way of engaging with the world, something that we could perhaps associate with what you call westernized modernity. And so here I'm thinking of like mindfulness, which you can find mindfulness workshops in most companies now, microdosing on hallucinogenics. Burning Man Festival has been apparently overrun with people from the tech companies of the Silicon Valley. So I was wondering how, do these contemporary practices of engaging with alternative approaches to reality, how do they relate to your work? Or maybe they don't. So I think I'm going to end there actually. So it kind of boils down to 3 questions. The relationship between word, image, and the movement between voices. The distinction between information and language. Is there one, and is it relevant? And, how do these contemporary practices of alternative realities, which often draw on many of the sources and thinkers that you yourself draw upon, how do they relate to your work?
Fantastic. Thank you, Beatrice, very much. And I realize you're in the room right next to me. We could have shouted to each other. Anyway, Federico, if you would unmute, and among the 3 pages of single-space notes I just took, pick out a few things to just pick up on quickly, because whatever happens, we have to finish at past. And that doesn't leave us a lot of time for engagement. I will allow you, sorry, I didn't realize that you were forcibly muted. I do apologize. So pick up wherever you want. That's a huge amount to try to address. But over to you first, and then hopefully we'll leave a little bit of time for some conversation with the rest of the audience. You're good.
Okay. Thank you. I'll be as brief as possible. And before even saying thanks to the respondents, I want to apologize, talking of unmuting, because the problem of being at home, my neighbor decided to play Eye of the Tiger very loudly just now. So it will be the soundtrack to what I'm going to say. I apologize. It's not intentional. So first of all, thank you very much for John, Liana, and Beatrice for the responses. It's a wealth of questions and lines of flight. And so first I want to say that I will not be able to, any answer that I will give will be insufficient necessarily, okay? So let me try to give some insufficient answers to your questions. I would like to start just chronologically, because I've been taking lots of notes myself with John. And in particular, when the first observation, which I thought was, everything that's been said so far is completely spot on, so I don't need to even repeat that. About the alternative cosmologies. Yes, as you've noticed, mine has a certain structure, quite hierarchical and so on, and the alternative is equally hierarchical. Is this the only possible way? First of all, I am no Kantian myself, so I don't have a desire to set the transcendental limits of the imagination as a universal for everybody. So, of course, as a first disclaimer, they betray my particular way of understanding things, and I don't think I have touched upon the absolute truth of worlding. However, there might be some parts to it that might answer to your question, in particular when you mentioned the possibility of non-hierarchical cosmologies. And in that sense, I think the attempt of the cosmology of magic, as I try to present it, tackles that problem, at least it tries. I said it was an experiment in anarchism, etymologically, as in having to do with the arche, so with the principle, the origin of reality. To a certain extent, I am inclined to believe that people in general, universalizing, tend to have a certain necessity to ground logical assumptions, to ground logics on some fundamental principles. I think of Euclid's Elements as a typical example. The fact that any logical system tends to have some arche at the beginning. It's no coincidence that the arche was the beginning of Greek philosophy. by placing the arche in the ineffable, is an attempt to produce a non-hierarchical structure, in the sense that the arche is not there, is anarchism. In that sense, there is an arche, but the arche is not countable within the system. Thus, the arche is not denied as a necessity, but it's deactivated. So that was my attempt in that sense. The second question, and apologies for being so rapid in my responses, has been to do with how one would live in the world of magic, and especially with such a prominence of the individual. In this case, among the kind of like many different allies that one could think of in this line of thinking, I would summon Simone Weil in particular, and her way of understanding, which shares some similarities with what I've been presenting as a world form of magic, even though it has also many differences. But in her way of presenting it, the individual is always and of necessity the start and end point of any political action, because simultaneously what you have on the other side, the collective identities, being Italian, for example, or being white, or being in themselves, are what Max Stirner, the anarchist philosopher, would call spooks. The danger is assigning them agency within the world. It's a dangerous thing, because you assign agency to things that are not subject, they're not the heart of a responsibility, they're not embodied in a feeling position, but they are normative abstractions, so to say. So with Simone Weil, I would contend that always already it is the case that the individual is the center of political action when it is politics. It is a politeia of a community of people coming together. When it is a normative abstraction taking over, it's no longer politics in that sense. And the final question was on the opposition, the stark opposition between technique and magic. And absolutely, you're right. Most people live in between these two things. In the final part of the book, I try to present ways of doing that, outside, within, takia, and as if. But I would like, once again, since we're talking about anarchism, this was a similar point that was made by the great British anarchist Colin Ward, when he was explaining how in society, anarchism is what allows society to remain, to sustain itself in any case. A family that is not dysfunctional, a respectful group of friends, is already an anarchist cell. And it is thanks to these anarchist cells that then everything else can take place. Equally, magic is already there at the heart of technique, but not in a majoritarian position, in the same way that anarchism is already there, even in a dictatorial state, even though it's not in a majoritarian position. And to move even briefly again to Iliana's comments, which were pointed in particular on perennialism, that is a tradition of thinking that I draw a lot from, absolutely, René Guénon being one of them, but especially Henri Corbin, and Ananda Coomaraswamy also in part. First of all, I have to give a disclaimer. René Guénon is somebody I draw from in the same way that I draw from Heidegger. As in, I don't necessarily draw from the politics of the thinker, I draw from parts of his thought. René Guénon, I find an exceedingly important thinker in his own time, but definitely not a political thinker that I would like to take on board. He thinks about this medieval society made of castes. So far from me endorsing René Guénon's political project. However, what I would contend is that I would not agree with the distinction so stark between, for example, Europe and Islam that is presented in the way that perennialism is a European project necessarily, to use Islam as a tool to heal itself. First of all, because I don't think the two elements are comparable, in that Europe is a pseudo-national identity, so to say, post-national, pre-national, anyway, a pseudo-national identity, and Islam is not. It's, Iqbal was suggesting it as a national identity, of course, but I would contend still that Islam is not a national identity, while Europe is or tries to be. So in that sense, I wouldn't cut between them in that way as you would cut between two comparable objects. Finally, when we talk about the perennialist milieu, some of them, for example, Guénon being himself Muslim, it's difficult to position. He lived in Cairo, and his allegiance with France was very feeble to a certain extent. he had this romantic, modern European, I would say, like late romantic fantasy about going back to the Middle Ages and all that kind of stuff, which I completely agree with you that is highly problematic. However, I'm not sure that it can be framed entirely within an Orientalist project in that, in the Saidian sense of the word. I was trying in that sense with what I was doing with the notion of the Mediterranean to tackle a little bit this problem by presenting not an opposition between Europe or the West and the Islamic world as a national or geographical place, but by creating a place in between, so to say, a Middle West and a Middle East. I come from the Middle West. Southern Italy is the Middle West, if you wish, in the way that Lebanon is the Middle East. The Mediterranean region in itself, which was destroyed by the arrival of modernity. I mean, the swan song being Pico della Mirandola. It finished the moment in which the Muslims were thrown out of Granada in 1492, not because of Christopher Columbus in America, but because of the Muslim being kicked out and Lorenzo Magnifico dying. That kind of world, it's in a different position. That was the very end, 1492, but it was the world of Roman antiquity, and the world that brought Egyptian culture to Greece, for example. Greece is indebted with Egypt, or Neoplatonism itself is an Egyptian product. Plotinus was Egyptian, and it's difficult to position Neoplatonism anywhere. Is it Middle Eastern, Middle West? It's Mediterranean. So in that sense, I was trying to tackle that problem. And so also my positioning, when you say, when you were mentioning about the we, in that sense, the we as we in westernized modernity is a contextual problem, as in I was observing from this particular place of observation, which I happen to inhabit in the way of migrants. I mean, I happen to be in London, accidents of life. I don't see that as let's say as a location of the spirit, as just a point of perspective in the way that one is placed in the world. And then moving finally to Beatrice, just to leave a little bit of time so that other people can intervene. And again, apologies for not being able to respond to everything adequately. Oh no, sorry, actually, so just one thing about Liana's point on witchcraft was very interesting. And I do agree that probably my off-mark kind of remark about witchcraft being and so on, it was a bit flippant. In itself, obviously in itself, there is nothing that disqualifies it. And this reminds me a little bit of the debates on magic theurgy that you had in the Neoplatonic milieu at the end of late antiquity, with people, some people advocating as a viable solution, and people saying that it was just like a teenage fantasy. It is the use, of course, that is done of it. And I believe, of course, that it is possible. Witchcraft, also in the kind of TikTok way, it is done, can produce real results. Depends on the use. I was just suspicious because it seems to be steeped in a certain milieu, hyper-capitalist milieu, that often deactivates those possibilities, but that doesn't mean that those possibilities are not there. And finally, Beatrice, and thank you for the questions there as well, about the creation, the composition of Prophetic Culture, the second book that will come out in May. Text, images, and narratives as a story. I would like to focus in particular on the factor of the story, the adventure story at the end. In part, it has to do with my own experience telling stories to a young child, so and understanding in a way how you can convey certain ideas in that particular form. In part, it comes from reading Plato. The idea of a ecos mythos, of a likely story being philosophy itself. It's a traditional way, or reading Nietzsche, if you like, or reading Suravardi. But also it's in itself a philosophical point, in the sense that I was suggesting that the idea of reality we have around ourselves, what we call the world, is a story, which every time changes depending on the particular theme that is adopted in a certain moment in time. So presenting my own vision of reality expressively and explicitly as a story was in a way also an attempt to demonstrate that they all are stories, which means they are necessary and the only place that we can inhabit. But we need to just remember that they are narrative artifacts, which doesn't mean that they're false. They're neither false nor real. They're fictional, which doesn't take anything away from them. Then about the difference between language and information. I think just to summarize it in 5 seconds, unfortunately, we could maybe imagine it as the difference between a dictionary and a novel, in the sense that information, like a dictionary, has a certain element of closure within itself. It's a system that communicates itself, doesn't refer to anything outside, in the way that in a dictionary, every word is explained by all the others. Language, at least as a potentiality, can be in the form of information, but when it's not in the form of information, is like a novel, a story that talks about something outside of the book. The disappearance of the outside to the book is what I try to describe by describing magic and by describing the particular form of information/data. And yeah, finally, the point on therapy, I found also very interesting because, yeah, I discussed it many times in both books, the idea of therapy more than the idea of politics. Why? Because once again, my attempt in particular, and this is just my attempt, I don't think it's the best or the only possible attempt, but my attempt is to work on the starting point rather than the end point. And therapy often tries to do that. Is an attempt not so much as at making somebody capable of achieving certain results specifically, unless it's CBT, in which case it often is, but mostly to have a different starting point from which they can approach the daily job of life. And so in that sense, what I try to do is therapeutic, but also because therapy from theraps means comrade. Therapy is comradeship. The idea of solidarity, which is deployed in different ways. A therapeutic work is a work that tries to have an element of comradeship, of friendship, and ultimately, the discussion among friends is an esoteric discussion, is a private discussion. Esoterism, I believe, is the way in which you speak among friends, while exoterism is the way you speak to people in a rally. And so, in a way, having a therapeutic approach, to my mind, constitutes the esoteric quality of what I try to do. And yeah, I think that's it for now.
Yeah, that's very impressive. I think you touched on all of the key questions that were posed. Federico, don't mute because I don't want you to not be able to unmute again.
Okay. Yeah.
Let me just quickly, we only have 10 minutes, so let me quickly draw together a few of the questions that have come up in the chat during particularly your answers to the responses. And again, no need to apologize for any of this. This is extremely ambitious and you're touching on so many different areas. I think a number of questions have circled around your treatment of language. And in particular, it's interesting to think whether this connects the first book to the second one. And there's maybe a point of just clarification because prophecy and prophetic culture might be so strongly associated with language, with discourse. So it was maybe a little bit confusing how something you associate in the first book with technic rather than magic becomes the vehicle for magic in the second book. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, but maybe you could clarify that crucial point.
Absolutely, it's a crucial point, and thank you to whoever asked the question.
It was Eduardo Fernandez.
Eduardo for giving me an opportunity to explain this. Absolutely, yes. The attempt of creating a reality system, which I do in Technique and Magic, in the magic part, is centered around the ineffable. Nonetheless, since mine is not a mystical project in the sense of like I'm creating a monastic community in the Syrian desert, but it's an attempt of creating, let's say, a moderate livable world. The moderate livable world, the world itself as a cosmos, is a construction of language, and it is inevitable that we have to deal with language. My attempt was not of denying language and denouncing language as a force of evil. My attempt was just to point out that when language is closed onto itself, then you start having problems. Reality disintegrates, you live in a state of perennial anxiety because you could be cut out of language at any point. If you lose your job or a limb or your passport and you go extinct before you die, that happened to many people. Now, my attempt then was not to deny language. Language is absolutely necessary. And in prophetic culture, I try to explain better how I imagine that it is possible to use language to create a different world, to make world differently, to create a different cosmos. So that is the way I think language should be understood within this project. When I say language, I would like just to clarify. When I say language, I mean especially institutions. I myself, Federico, I am an institution in the way that each person is an institution. The ego is an institution of language. Now, so when I think about restructuring language, I'm suggesting about restructuring the institutions of language. Here, once again, the therapeutic aspect comes in, but also the political aspect. The quality of an institution being linguistic, we are capable of reshaping it. We have to remain, I believe, aware that when we eradicate from the horizon and viewpoint of the institution, the acknowledgement that the institution being a linguistic form deals with things that have a spark of ineffability that is irreducible to it, the institution is never even meant to be able to comprehend everything or to capture everything or to account for everything. So yeah, just to clarify, and thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Two other questions, just all related to language as it happens. The first one is from Johannes von Mueller, who's having internet problems, and so he can't ask it himself. But he wants to put a little pressure on your quite dramatic example from the beginning about the drowned migrants. And he says, there is indeed a language in which the deaths of refugees can be described as an event, and it's the language of economics. Every drowned person equals saved costs. The zero, not only in the language of mathematics, but especially of economics, is of course far from being nothing. What does this mean then concerning an absolute language? Is there a hierarchy between the various languages that add up to the absolute language, or is is once more, as boring and familiar as it may sound, economy or economics the one and absolute language?
Thank you for the question again, and also for picking on that particular example. One of the inspirations for the book at the very beginning, which was written in 2016 but came from before, was watching an interview with a Labour politician that was commenting on Theresa May's suggestion to sink the migrant boats in the channel, which are actually very few also. And the Labour politician was replying saying that would have been really bad for the economy. It was a bad idea for the economy. And the moment I heard that, I realized that we were never going to win that way. That was exactly the problem was exactly that. Like thinking in those terms means being exactly on the same place, in the same exact position in which those policies were imagined. So thank you for bringing that particular example. The language of economics in itself is not absolute language. The language of economics is just a language, and actually in itself originally is one of the most sacred languages, having to do with the ecos, no? Economics is ecos, so the house. The construction of the house is the construction of the living space, of the sacred space, of the primordial cosmos in the microcosm, and so on and so forth. So in itself, maybe the language of nomos, economics, so that is a bit more problematic because it's in that sense a strong normative work on the house. So anyway, without going too deep into the problem of economics in itself is not the problem, it's the way in which it is declinated. Once again, let's keep the metaphor of the house. The problem is similar to the way in which you build skyscrapers in Dubai. So skyscrapers are never meant to be inhabited by anybody. If economics deals with a house in which nobody lives, then the things that come through it are entirely disposable as units of information, as data. Migrants being saved costs, possibly, or missed opportunities for investment, on the other hand. If we imagine economics as the work on the house, once again, around the idea that there is somebody within the house, somebody that is not the house, that is not reducible to the house or the language of the house, something ineffable, then it changes. The problem, once again, not being economics itself, but the articulation of the language of economics.
Thank you very much for that. I just have one more question about language, and I should say that a couple of other questions have come into the chat just to me, and I think maybe writing to everybody has been disabled, and if so, I apologize. So I'm going to save the chat comments, and of course I'll send them to you, Federico, so you have a full record. Exactly. So you'll have all of the questions, as if there weren't enough already, but I think there's a couple of really good ones in there that you might want to contemplate. But apologies to people who haven't been able to ask. But I have one more from Valerie Seong, which is about in some way picking up, I guess, on Beatrice's question around a distinction between language and information. And the question really is, again, is there another danger of an overly binary or overly linear way of engaging with the world? As a poet, I work at the threshold of language and information, in between the dictionary and the novel, where language is both conveying data as well as the open system aspects of being itself. Would it not be more helpful to understand this work as a constant threshold poetics rather than as static states?
Yeah, okay, no, I see that absolutely. And the problem of binary is complicated once again, depending on how it is adopted. As in, on the one hand, and this is, of course, my personal opinion, but on the one hand, binaries, of course, produce terrible results in that they separate the world into fields, and they don't allow for anything between or for anything non-conforming. They reproduce a certain kind of like pseudo-dialectical relationship, which always ends up in conflict, and so on and so forth. But that particular danger that comes with binaries, once again, I believe, has to do not with the notion of having two principles in itself, but with the use which it is done. So by looking at the two principles as truly encompassing everything, the two limits are the two limits of reality itself. The way I tried to do it in Technique and Magic was, as John Tresh observed kindly at the beginning, by always posing another limit above the limit. Top and bottom, top and bottom. That is to say that the frame is just a frame floating in water. Imagine literally it is like a frame floating on a body of water. And it frames only what you see. It doesn't frame the river. And in that sense, binaries might be useful to provide the context within which we play. I use the word play specifically because one of the things that I try to suggest is that the approach to the creation of institutions and the relationship with life itself can contain an element of playfulness. Once again, not the neoliberal work hard, play hard playfulness, but an element of authentic playfulness as understood by Eugene Fink, for example, or Roger Caillois. So an element of playfulness that is allowed only once it is remembered that the game board is a game board in a larger room, that there is an outside to the game board, that the cat walks through the chessboard sometimes and push down the pieces, that somebody calls you from the other room and you get off. This understanding of the world as not encompassing everything doesn't take away the necessity of framing it, so the necessity of having binaries in the sense of a rigid frame, but deactivates the rigidity of the frame by reminding that there is an outside. And for example, just to conclude, when I talk about prophetic culture, I intend prophetic especially in that way. Prophetic not having to do with prediction, so the idea that prophecy can cover the totality of the world and of existence, so on, but prophecy having to do with the fact that time itself not existing as a philosophical concept, as we all know, inexistent also as a logical concept, and also non-existent also as a scientific concept more recently. The time itself is limited, is a particular narrative necessity that we have to inhabit a certain world, to play a certain game, and that's it. We do need it, like language, to live, but there is an outside. If we slip out of it, we don't slip out into nothingness. And who holds power within that frame only holds power within the frame.
So as we slip outside, because we are literally about to be cut off, I just quickly wanted to jump in, Federico, and thank you again for such a rich session, incredibly rich session. It was the biggest audience I think I've ever had in my 3 years here for a work in progress, and it was certainly the biggest scope we've ever tried to tackle in a midday work in progress session. So thank you for bringing so much to the table, and thanks especially to Beatrice again, and to John and Liana for bringing even more to the table. Incredibly rich and helpful. I will share the chat with you just so you've got a full record, but I wish I could unmute everyone, but I seem to have lost the magic power to do that, but I'm sure everyone applauds.
Thanks everybody, and
very grateful. Thanks everybody.
Thank you very much.
Okay, everybody. Bye.